I sat in the rocking chair on the veranda of my house and watched the last rays of sunlight color the Grand Forks sky with shades of purple and gold. My old bones ached, reminding me that I was 78, but my mind remained as sharp as a knife blade. The habit of noticing details had not disappeared with age. An occupational deformity, as they say. When you work as a private investigator for decades, the world around you becomes a puzzle that you constantly want to solve. The house I lived in was too big for a lonely old man. A two-story Victorian mansion with 4 bedrooms, a spacious living room, library, and study that I had turned into a sanctuary for my memories. The prestigious neighborhood, the manicured garden, the antique furnishings, all of this was completely out of keeping with my financial situation as a retired former private investigator. But every house has a story, and this house's story was closely intertwined with my own. I reached for the glass of whiskey on the small table next to the chair. The liquid amber shimmered in the light of the setting sun. One sip, and a pleasant warmth spread through my body. It was my daily ritual, a glass of good whiskey, and the memories that came to me like ghosts at dusk. Today I was remembering the day that changed my life forever. The day I met Reed Emerson. That was 40 years ago. I was then an ambitious private investigator of 38, with a reputation for finding things that others preferred to overlook. Reed was then a young man just starting out in the Grand Forks underworld. Smart, ruthless, but with some kind of special code of honor. He was accused of murdering a rival, and the evidence was strong. A gun with fingerprints, witness testimony, motive. The police were sure the case was closed, but Reed hired me to find the real killer. And I did. More specifically, I found evidence that Reed couldn't physically commit this murder. But with it, I found other evidence. Documents that could put him behind bars for years for completely different crimes. Racketeering, money laundering, bribing officials. The list was long. I remember the moment I held those papers in my hands. A moment of choice. I could have taken them to the police, and then Reed Emerson would have disappeared from my life forever, becoming just another client on my record. But I didn't. Instead, I destroyed the evidence. Why? Even now, all these years later, I can't give a clear answer. Maybe because Reed wasn't guilty of that murder. Maybe because I was impressed with his straightforwardness and honesty. As honest as a man of his profession can be. Maybe it was because I saw in him something that I lacked in myself. Freedom from the conventions and rules that held my life together. Reed was acquitted, and I got the house. Not ownership, no. The house had always belonged to Reed. But he allowed me to live here for as long as I wished. "It's the least I can do for you, Woodrow," he said then. And I took him up on his offer. The sound of a car pulling up pulled me out of the abyss of memories. Headlights illuminated the driveway, and I saw my son's silver sedan. Preston came to see me every Thursday. It was our tradition. But today was Tuesday. Something had happened. I set the glass on the table and straightened in my chair. Age was taking its toll, and every movement was difficult. But I didn't want my son to see me weak. Preston got out of the car. Even in the twilight, I could see he was tense. Tall, lean, with the same sharp features I'd had as a young man. But he had inherited his mother's character. Soft, pliant, too trusting for this world. "Hello, Father," he said, coming up to the veranda. "I'm sorry for the unexpected visit." "Adoration. You can always come unannounced," I said, gesturing for him to sit in the chair next to me. "Whiskey?" He nodded, and I poured him a shot from the decanter. Preston took the glass, but didn't drink it, just held it in his hands, staring out at the darkening garden. "What's the matter?" when I asked. "Trouble at work?" Preston was a lawyer at a firm specializing in corporate law. Not the most exciting field, in my opinion, but my son had always been drawn to stability and order. "No, the job's fine." He took a sip of whiskey and grimaced. "I've never been able to appreciate good alcohol. Me and Mina, we're going through a rough patch." I nodded, not showing surprise. Mina Holly had become my sister-in-law 7 years ago. A beautiful woman with cold eyes and a smile that never reached those eyes. I saw right through her from the first time I met her. Ambitious, calculating, always knowing what she wanted. And what she wanted usually belonged to others. "Every marriage has its trials," I said, though I didn't believe what I was saying. My own marriage had ended tragically with my wife dying of cancer 15 years ago, But before that, we'd had 30 happy years together. Tut. It wasn't just the trial, Preston tapped his fingers nervously on the glass. She's changed. Or maybe I just hadn't seen what she was like before. Always talking about money, about how we should live better, have more. Asking about your will. The last phrase was said quietly, almost bashfully. I grinned. And what did you answer her? The truth. That we never discussed it, Preston looked up at me. I'm sorry, Father. I know it's not a pleasant topic. At my age, death is nothing more than another bend in the road, I replied. But Mina might be disappointed. I don't have much besides this house and a few trinkets. That was a lie, of course. I didn't even have a house. But neither Preston nor Mina knew that. To them, I was the owner of this mansion, and I never dissuaded them of that. The house is worth a lot of money, Preston said, especially now that real estate prices in the area have gone up. And Mina had already calculated how much she could get for it. I couldn't help but be sarcastic. Father, please, Preston sighed. She's not like that. She's just complicated. Complicated was too mild a definition for Mina. I'd seen women like that in my long life. They were like sharks, always on the move, always hungry. And if you bled, they knew no pity. I'm sorry, I took a sip of whiskey. It's just that I'm worried about you. I always have. I know, Preston smiled weakly. I worry about you too. Aren't you lonely out here by yourself? I have my books, my memories, and sometimes good company. I nodded at him. Siwitwari, what more could an old man want? We sat for a while longer, talking about nothing, about his work, about politics, about the past. But I felt that Preston hadn't told me everything. Something else was troubling him, something he didn't dare to talk about. As he got ready to leave, I invited him and Mina to dinner that Saturday. He looked surprised. Usually I was the one who came over, not the other way around. But he agreed. Nakano, Mom. I haven't cooked in a long time, but I think I still remember how to do it, I said as I walked him to the car. Don't bother, Father. We can bring food from the restaurant. No way, I patted him on the shoulder. I want to make it myself. Your mother's old recipes. She'd want the tradition to continue. The mention of his mother always softened Preston. He nodded, gave me a hug, and left. I returned to the veranda and sat down in the chair again. Night had fully fallen, and the stars twinkled over Grand Forks like jewels scattered on black velvet. I thought about my son and his wife, about the cracks in their marriage that were growing wider and wider, about Mina starting to take an interest in my possessions. It didn't bode well. 40 years ago, I made a choice that changed my life. I tied my fate to Reed Emerson's. I lived in his house, enjoyed his protection, though I tried not to abuse it. In all those years, I'd asked him for help only twice, when Preston needed a position at a prestigious law firm, and when my wife was dying and needed experimental drugs from abroad. Reed never turned me down, and I knew he wouldn't say no now if I asked for help again. But was I ready to drag him into my family problems? Was I ready to reveal the truth about the house, about our relationship with Reed? I took one last sip of whiskey and set the empty glass on the table. Decisions could wait. In the meantime, I needed to get ready for Saturday night dinner. Saturday came faster than I expected. I spent the day in the kitchen preparing Preston's favorite dishes. Beef stroganoff from his mother's recipe, potato salad, and apple pie for dessert. Cooking distracted me from my anxious thoughts, filling the house with aromas that evoked memories of happier times. At exactly 7 p.m., I heard the sound of a car pulling up. Looking out the window, I saw Preston and Mina getting out of the car. They weren't talking to each other, keeping their distance. All the signs of marital discord were there. Mina looked as flawless as ever, an elegant black dress, perfect makeup, her hair in a tight bun. But there was something new in her gaze, some calculation, some anticipation. She was looking around the house as if assessing its value. I met them at the door with a smile that I hoped looked genuine. Welcome. I kissed Mina on the cheek and hugged my son. Come in. Dinner's almost ready. It smells delicious, Mina said as she entered the house. Her eyes quickly glanced around the living room, lingering on the antique clock that stood by the fireplace. Did you make all this yourself, Woodrow? Adoam. Old habits are hard to break, I answered, leading them into the dining room, where the table was already set. When you live alone, You learn to take care of yourself. But this house is too big for one person, Mina said, sitting down at the table. Have you ever thought of selling it and moving to something more manageable? I saw Preston cast a warning glance at her, but she ignored it. Never, I answered, pouring wine into glasses. There are too many memories here. Memories won't keep you warm in the winter or take care of you when you're sick, Mina said, taking the glass. And the money from the sale could provide you with a comfortable old age and maybe help Preston with his career. My career is perfectly fine, Mina, Preston said sharply. Of course, darling, she bestowed upon him a smile that didn't touch her eyes. I'm just saying that we could all use the extra resources. I started putting dinner on plates, watching this exchange of remarks. The tension between them was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Let's not talk business at dinner, I said, sitting down at the head of the table. Tell me about your week, I said, sitting down at the head of the table. Dinner continued in the same vein. Polite surface talk, intense undercurrents. Mina continued to cast appraising glances at the house furnishings, and Preston became more and more taciturn with each glass of wine. After dessert, I offered to let Preston help me with the coffee, leaving Mina in the dining room. Once we were in the kitchen, my son finally spoke up. I'm sorry about Mina, Dad. She didn't mean to be tactless. Oh, I think that's exactly what she meant, I replied, preparing the coffee pot. She never does anything without a purpose, and today her purpose was to evaluate her potential inheritance. Preston sighed and lowered himself into a chair. We're getting a divorce, he said quietly. I was going to tell you, but I didn't want to spoil dinner. I paused for a moment, trying to act surprised. But honestly, I'd been expecting it from the moment they stepped through the door. I'm sorry, I said, and it was the truth. Sorry not that their marriage was over, but that Preston had suffered. She cheated on me, he continued, looking down at the floor, with a co-worker of mine, for over a year now. I only found out about it 2 weeks ago. Shimamur. And now she wants half of your estate. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Not just half of ours, Umarin. Preston looked up at me. She says that since I'm your only heir, I'm entitled to this house now, and she wants me to sue you for it as part of our divorce settlement. It wasn't so much Mina's insolence that surprised me, but the fact that Preston had told me about it. Maybe there was more of me in him than I thought. What did you say to her? I asked, pouring coffee into cups. That I would never do that. Preston shook his head. This is your house, Dad. It'll be yours as long as you live. If only he knew how wrong that statement was. But I just nodded and patted him on the shoulder. Thank you, son. I appreciate your loyalty. I picked up the tray of coffee cups. Now let's go back to our guest and see what else she has in store for us. When we returned to the dining room, Mina wasn't there. I put the tray on the table and looked around. She must be in the restroom, Preston said, but his voice sounded uncertain. At that moment, we heard the sound of drawers opening and closing from my office at the other end of the house. I set down the cup I was holding and quickly headed that way. Preston followed me. We found Mina at my desk. She was looking through the folders of documents I kept in the drawers. What are you doing? Preston asked sharply. Mina lifted her head, not a shadow of remorse on her face. I'm looking for the deeds to the house, she answered calmly. I want to know how much it's worth. This is an invasion of privacy. Preston was furious. You have no right to go through my father's things. Awesome. Oh, I have every right. Mina closed the folder she was holding and placed it on the table. If you refuse to fight for your inheritance, I'll do it for you. You're too weak, Preston. You always have been. I watched this scene with growing concern. Not because of the papers. There was nothing in this office that could reveal the truth about the house. The real papers were kept in a safety deposit box. What worried me was Mina. Her determination, her ruthlessness. She was more dangerous than I realized. I think you'd better leave, I said calmly. Both of you. I need time to think about all this. Preston looked ashamed, and Mina looked triumphant as they left my house. I stood on the veranda watching their car disappear into the darkness and knew this was just the beginning. I went back into the study and checked to see exactly what Mina was looking at. Nothing much. Old bills, photos, letters, but her actions showed how far she was willing to go. I sat in my chair for a long time that evening, looking at the fire in the fireplace and wondering what to do next. I was 78 years old, and I had hoped to spend the rest of my days in peace, but it seemed that fate had prepared another test for me. I knew I had to talk to Reed, tell him the situation, warn him about Mina and her ambitions, and perhaps ask for help one last time. The next morning I woke up at the crack of dawn, as I had done for the past 50 years. Some habits don't go away, even with age. I slowly got out of bed, feeling my joints crunching. My body was like an old car that takes longer and longer to warm up every year. After a cup of strong black coffee and a modest breakfast, I dressed in my best suit, a navy blue suit with a vest, old-fashioned but elegant. Visits to Reed Emerson required a certain etiquette, even after so many years of acquaintance. I stared at the phone for a long moment before dialing. Reed preferred to be contacted through his assistants, but he always made an exception for me. A personal number that changed every few months. Woodrow. His voice sounded the same as it had 40 years ago, low and husky. What a pleasant surprise. Hello, Reed. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. I need to talk to you. A pause, not long but noticeable. Is there a problem? There was no concern in his tone, only interest. Maybe. Nothing urgent, but... I understand, he interrupted. Come tonight, 4 o'clock. You know where. He hung up without waiting for an answer. Reed had always been a man of few words. 4 o'clock was a few hours away, and I decided to spend that time looking through old photo albums. Sentimentality is an old man's weakness, but I was allowing myself that weakness more and more often. Pictures of Preston as a child, snapshots of my late wife, old Christmas cards. These little things made up the story of my life. At 3 o'clock sharp, I left the house and got into my old Buick, another relic of the past that I refused to change. The car started on the second try, and I headed toward the river, toward the northern edge of Grand Forks. Reed's office was in an old textile mill he'd turned into his headquarters 25 years ago. Officially, the building belonged to a furniture company, but everyone in town knew the real owner was Reed Emerson. I parked in the service parking lot and slowly approached the side entrance. 2 young men in dark suits stood on either side of the door. One of them stepped forward, blocking my path. Do you have an appointment? He asked, looking at me, sizing me up. Woodrow Kirby, I answered, to see Reed Emerson, 4 o'clock. The young man glanced at me. An old man in an old-fashioned suit hardly looked dangerous, but he checked the list on his phone before nodding and opening the door. 3rd floor, he said. Thomas will show you out. The second guard, who was obviously Thomas, gestured for me to follow him. We took the elevator to the 3rd floor, and Thomas led me down a long hallway with cream-colored walls and soft carpeting. At the end of the hallway was a solid oak door. Thomas knocked and, without waiting for an answer, opened the door. Mr. Kirby is here, sir, he said and stepped aside, letting me pass through. Reed Emerson's office was astonishing in its size. A huge space with high ceilings, panoramic windows overlooking the river, and furniture that looked expensive enough to pay for a college education. Reed himself sat behind a massive mahogany desk. Time had changed his appearance, but not his essence. His hair, once black as pitch, was now white, his face wrinkled, but his eyes, dark, deep, impenetrable, remained the same, as was the aura of power that surrounded him. Woodrow, he rose from the table and came to me, extending his hand. It's good to see you. I shook his hand, a firm, confident handshake, despite his age. Reed was in his 70s, but he moved with the energy of a man half his age. Alkanutum, have a seat. He pointed to a leather chair by a low table. Would you like a drink? I'd love one, I replied, settling into the chair. Reed went to the bar, which was hidden behind a panel in the wall, and pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. How's your health? And he asked, pouring us both a drink. Better than I deserve, I replied. My heart's a little jumpy sometimes, but other than that, I can't complain. Reed nodded and handed me the glass before sitting down in the chair across from me. To old friends, he said, raising his glass. To old friends, I echoed, and we drank. The whiskey was excellent, smooth, with notes of smoke and honey. Reed always knew how to appreciate the good stuff. So, he set the glass on the table. What brings you to me? I took another sip, gathering my thoughts. My son is getting a divorce, I said finally. Reed raised an eyebrow. And that's cause for concern? His wife, Mina. I shook my head. She wants the house. Reed leaned back in his chair, his face expressionless. Your house? He asked, even though we both knew it wasn't my house. Yeah, I set the glass down. Yesterday she went through my papers looking for the real estate deeds. But they're not there. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Of course they're not. I'm not that stupid, I grinned. But she won't stop. She thinks I'm just a plain old man who can't defend himself. Reed smiled, but that smile didn't touch his eyes. She's wrong, he said simply. We sat in silence for a while. It was starting to get dark outside the window. Fall days are short in Grand Forks. Do you remember the first time we met, Woodrow? Reed asked suddenly. I nodded. How could I forget? I'm in that bar on Pine Street, I answered. You were young then, but you already had a reputation. And you were the only detective in town who hadn't been bought by the police. Reed grinned. I knew I could trust you. You were a risk taker. I've always been a good judge of character. He poured more whiskey into our glasses. And you proved me right when you destroyed those documents. I took the glass in silence. It was a choice that shaped the rest of my life. Whether it was right or wrong, I still didn't know. But I've never regretted it. You know, Reed continued, you've only asked for help twice in all these years. Most people in your place would have abused my gratitude. I never wanted to be in debt, I replied. And that's why you've never been in it, Reed raised his glass. Here's to honesty in an unfair world. We drank, and I felt a warmth spread through my body. What were you thinking about when you destroyed those documents? Reed asked. All these years I always wanted to know. I wondered. It was a question I'd asked myself many times. About how life is rarely black and white, I finally answered. You didn't kill that man. You deserve justice in that case, even if in others. I shrugged. I figured I could be a judge in one case, but not in your whole life. Reed nodded as if that was the answer he expected to hear. The house will always be yours, Woodrow, he said, returning to our original topic. As long as you live, no one will kick you out of it. You can be sure of that. Thank you, I said, sincerely grateful. But I don't want you to interfere directly. Not yet, at least. Mina is part of my son's life, and I don't want to cause him any more problems than he already has. Whatever you say, Reed tilted his head. But if the situation changes, I'll let you know. I finished the whiskey and set the glass down. Thank you for having me. Always, Reed stood up and I followed suit. I hope you'll come back with better news next time. I hope so too, I replied, shaking his hand in farewell. Thomas walked me back to my car and I drove home, feeling both reassured and anxious. Relieved because I knew Reed would keep his word. Anxious because I realized that if Mina kept insisting, it could lead to consequences I wanted to avoid. It was already dark when I turned onto my street. Most of the houses were lit up. People were coming home from work. Families were gathering for dinner. Normal life, which had always been a bit foreign to me. I slowed down as I approached my house and noticed an unfamiliar car parked at the curb. A silver sedan, too new and expensive for the neighborhood. I drove past, turned around at the next intersection, and parked a few houses away in the shade of a large oak tree. With my headlights off, I watched. 15 minutes later, a woman emerged from my house, a slender figure, elegant coat. Even from a distance, I recognized Mina. She looked around, got into her car, and drove away. I waited a few more minutes before pulling up to my house. Inside, everything looked untouched, but I could feel her presence, the slight scent of perfume in the air, the barely visible footprints on the wooden floor. She wasn't just coming in, she was searching the house. I walked through every room, checking to see what exactly she might have been looking for. In the study, the drawers were slightly displaced. In the bedroom, the pillow on the bed wasn't lying the way I'd left it. But the most noticeable change I found in the living room was that the photograph of my late wife that stood on the mantelpiece was turned at a different angle. I corrected the photo, looking at Eliza's smiling face. If she were alive, what advice would she give me now? Probably would tell me that family is most important, but also remind me that sometimes you have to be tough to protect the ones you love. The ringing of the phone interrupted my musings. I picked up the phone expecting to hear Preston's voice, or maybe Reed's. Mr. Kirby? A woman's voice, cold and businesslike. It's Mina. Mina! I tried to make my voice sound surprised. To what do I owe the pleasure? I wanted to apologize for my behavior last night, she said smoothly, without hesitation, as if she were reading from a script. It was unforgivable. Yes, it was. I wasn't going to make it easy for her. But I accept your apology. A pause. She was clearly expecting a warmer reaction. I also wanted to talk to you about the house, she continued, in a more constructive way. My house? I emphasized the word my on purpose. Yes, I heard her take a deep breath. You see, Preston and I are really splitting up, and as part of our separation agreement, my house has nothing to do with your separation agreement, I interrupted. It belongs to me, not Preston. Technically, yes, she agreed, but Preston is your only heir. And when you're gone, the house goes to him. And since we're still married, half of his future inheritance is mine. I clutched the receiver so hard my fingers turned white. This woman talked about my death with the same ease that others talk about the weather. I'm still alive, Mina, I said slowly, and I plan to be for a long time to come. Of course you are, she agreed quickly. All I mean is that we could make arrangements now to avoid trouble in the future. For example, I could give up all claims to the house in exchange for, say, financial compensation. That's it. It wasn't the house she wanted, it was the money. That's an interesting offer, I said, trying to play along. And how much do you think is fair? Given the current real estate prices in your neighborhood, she said in a businesslike tone, as if she were reading a report, I think $250,000 would be a reasonable compensation. I could barely contain my laughter. $250,000 for a house that was worth 4 times as much. But of course, Mina didn't know that I didn't own the house at all. I need to think about it, I replied. It's a big decision. Of course, she said, a honeyed note in her voice. I understand. But don't think too long, Mr. Kirby. Sometimes procrastination only makes things more difficult. It was a threat, barely veiled by courtesy. I'll take your advice, I said. Now, if you don't mind, I've had a long day. Of course, she paused. But by the way, I stopped by this afternoon. I wanted to leave a note apologizing, but you weren't home. Ahin, ki. Yes, I was out on business. I didn't specify what kind of business. Next time, please call before you visit. Of course, she repeated. Good night, Mr. Kirby. I hung up, feeling the anger rising inside me. Not only had this woman broken into my house, but now she was lying to my face, trying to blackmail me. I was beginning to understand why my son had decided to divorce her. What would Reed do in my shoes? Probably something drastic and permanent. But I wasn't Reed. And despite everything, I was still a father who wanted to protect his son. I went back into the living room and sat in my chair, looking at the picture of Elise. Mina was becoming more and more dangerous. She wouldn't stop there, especially now that she thought she had hit the mark. I'd have to be ready for her next move, and maybe reach out to Reed for help sooner than I'd planned. After Mina's visit and her phone call, I spent several days in tense anticipation. Something told me it was the calm before the storm. She wasn't the type to back down easily, especially when money was involved. I doubled my precautions, checking the locks on doors and windows, keeping an eye out for parked cars on the street, always carrying my cell phone. The old private detective habits came in handy. Preston called twice, talking about some divorce papers, but he didn't mention the house or Mina. I kept quiet too, not wanting to complicate my son's already difficult situation. After all, it was his marriage, his mistake, his pain. As much as I wanted to protect him, some lessons everyone has to learn on their own. On the 4th day after my conversation with Reed, I was sitting in the library, rereading an old Raymond Chandler detective novel, when I heard the sound of a car pulling up. I put the book down and went to the window, carefully pulling back the heavy curtain. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the curb. Too expensive and new for my neighborhood, but not the silver sedan Mina had come in. The driver's door opened and I was surprised to see Mina herself, elegant as ever, in a navy blue suit and perfect hair. She looked like a lawyer going to an important meeting, which I suspected wasn't far from the truth. I stepped away from the window and took a deep breath, preparing myself for an unpleasant conversation. By the time the doorbell rang, I was in complete control of myself. When I opened the door, I feigned mild surprise. Hoahini, Mina, I said. I didn't expect to see you. Mr. Kirby, her tone was dry and businesslike. I need to talk to you. May I come in? I nodded and stepped back, letting her into the house. Mina walked into the living room like she owned the place and stood by the fireplace, looking at the pictures on the mantelpiece. I noticed that she was especially scrutinizing the picture of Preston standing next to me in front of this very house, a picture taken when we first moved in, almost 40 years ago. To what do I owe this visit? I asked, remaining standing. Mina turned to me, her face as emotionless as a mask. I've decided not to beat around the bush, Mr. Kirby, she said. I'm divorcing your son. Though I already knew it, hearing the official confirmation was unpleasant. Not because of Mina. Her leaving Preston's life could only be for the best. But I knew the pain it was causing my son. I'm sorry to hear that, I replied neutrally. I don't think you're really sorry, Mina grinned. You never loved me. I wanted my son to be happy, I said. If you made him happy, I would have accepted you. Well, that doesn't matter anymore. She waved my words away. What matters is what's happening now. And now, as part of our divorce proceedings, I plan to claim my share of the marital estate, including this house. There it is. A direct statement of her intentions. I expected it, but I still felt the anger rising inside. I forced myself to breathe evenly, keeping a calm expression on my face. This house is not part of your family property, I said quietly. It belongs to me, not Preston. Legally, yes, Mina agreed, but Preston is your only heir. And since our marriage is still valid, I'm entitled to a portion of his future inheritance. Only if I die before your divorce is finalized, I pointed out. Oh, and as you can see, I'm quite alive, and I don't plan to change that status anytime soon. No one plans to die, Mr. Kirby. Mina shrugged her shoulders with feigned indifference. But at your age, it could happen at any moment. It was almost an open threat. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't show fear. Instead, I smiled, the kind of smile that had made even the toughest criminals nervous in the past. Sweetheart, whatever you say, I said calmly, but if I were you, I wouldn't make plans for my real estate. You could be sorely disappointed. Something in my tone or expression made her frown. For a moment, the mask of self-assurance slipped, and I saw a glimmer of uncertainty in her eyes, but she quickly pulled herself together. Is that a threat? She asked, her chin lifted. No, I shook my head. Just a statement of fact. As a former private investigator, I've learned to anticipate problems and take precautions. Whatever precautions you take, Mr. Kirby, my lawyer will find a way around them. Mina smiled again, but now there was something predatory in her smile. I'll get what I think is fair compensation for the 7 years I wasted on your worthless son. It was too much. I could tolerate her threats against me, but insulting Preston was another matter entirely. I think you'd better leave, I said, pointing to the door. So if you have a complaint, have your lawyer contact Preston's lawyer. Oh, he will, Mina headed for the exit, but stopped next to me. One more thing, Mr. Kirby. I've noticed that you're quite close to some, interesting people in this town. Reed Emerson, for instance. I froze. So she did find something in her illegal search. A photo, maybe, or a reference in old records. I don't know what you're talking about, I replied, trying to sound genuinely surprised. I don't think the police or the IRS would be thrilled to learn about your ties to a known criminal mastermind, Mina continued, ignoring my denial. Especially if it turned out that the house didn't really belong to you, but to him. Now I was truly alarmed. She knew, or at least guessed, the reality of the situation, but I couldn't show her how close she'd gotten to the truth. That's ridiculous, I pretended to be amused by her words. You've been reading too many detective novels, Mina. Maybe, she shrugged. Or maybe I have proof. In any case, Mr. Kirby, I hope you'll be more cooperative when my lawyer contacts you. For your own good, and your son's. With those words, she walked out, leaving me standing in the hallway, feeling as if the house had suddenly become 10 degrees colder. I closed the door and returned to the living room, pouring myself a whiskey with a trembling hand. Mina had gone from simple greed to outright blackmail. She'd threatened not only me, but Preston, and even Reed. That made her far more dangerous than I'd realized. I sank down in my chair, trying to gather my thoughts. I needed to contact Reed to warn him, but before I could do anything, there was the sound of a car pulling up again. I went to the window, expecting to see Mina's black SUV, but this time it was Preston's modest blue Honda. My son looked haggard even from a distance. Hunched shoulders, hesitant movements, drooping head. He was a man on the edge. I went out on the porch to greet him. Preston looked up when he saw me and tried to smile, but the smile was so painful it physically hurt. "Hello, Father," he said, walking up the stairs. "I'm sorry for the unexpected visit. You can always come unannounced." I put my hand on his shoulder and led him into the house. "Whiskey?" "I guess so," he nodded. "No, let's do something stronger, if you've got any." I led him into the living room and took out a bottle of brandy from the bar that I kept for special occasions. It wasn't the special occasion I dreamed of, but Preston needed something to dull the pain right now. "Mina was here," I said, pouring the brandy into 2 glasses. Preston flinched as if struck by a blow. "I know." He took the glass from my hands. "She called me right afterward, bragging about how she'd put you in your place." "Well, her version of events may be a little different from reality." I sat down across from him. "She told me you were getting a divorce." "Yeah." Preston took a big sip of brandy and grimaced. "I filed for divorce 3 days ago. She was cheating on me, Dad, with a coworker of mine, for over a year." I wasn't surprised, but I still felt a pang of anger for my son. "I'm sorry," I said sincerely. "You know what the worst part is?" Preston stared into his glass as if that was where all the answers could be found. "I really loved her, despite all her faults, all our problems. I really thought we could make things work." I kept quiet, giving him a chance to talk. "Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone in grief is just listen." "But then I found her cell phone," Preston continued. "She left it at home when she left for a business meeting. There were messages, pictures." He shook his head as if trying to get rid of the memories. "And not just the cheating. She'd been leading a double life, Father, all this time." "What do you mean?" I stepped forward. "The reports of her hooking up with the goldfish are about me." The bitterness in Preston's voice was almost palpable. "Plans on how to access the family money. Calculations on the value of this house. It all started before we were even married. She never loved me. All she wanted was—" His voice broke. "Your potential inheritance," I finished for him. Preston nodded, finishing his brandy in one gulp. "She thought you were rich, Father," he said after a pause. "This house, your lifestyle. She thought you had millions hidden away somewhere, and that I'd end up with all of them." I sighed. The irony of the situation was that Mina was right and wrong at the same time. The house was indeed worth a fortune, but it had never belonged to me and would never be inherited by Preston. "She said she wanted to sue the house." I filled his glass again. "Yeah." Preston ran his hand through his hair. "Her lawyer had already listed it as property to be divided. I tried to explain that the house is yours, not mine, but she won't listen. She says that since I'm your sole heir, she's entitled to a portion of the future inheritance." "That's ridiculous," I said, even though I wasn't laughing at all. "No court would accept such a claim. Her lawyer says there are precedents." Preston shook his head. But it's not just the legal side. She's making threats, Dad. Says she has some information about you. Something to do with Reed Emerson?" I froze. So Mina wasn't just bluffing when she mentioned Reed. She'd actually found something and was already using it to pressure Preston. "What exactly is she saying?" I asked cautiously. "That you and this Emerson guy are tied up in some shady business?" Preston looked confused. "That the house really belongs to him, not you. That she could report it to the authorities if I didn't agree to her terms." I turned away, pretending I needed a refill on my whiskey, but really I just needed a pause to hide the look on my face. Mina was more dangerous than I thought. Much more dangerous. "That's absurd," I said, turning back with an impenetrable expression. "Reed Emerson is an old acquaintance. Nothing more. And I own the house, and the deeds prove it." That was a lie, of course. The documents, if read correctly, would show that the house belonged to a company that, through a series of shell companies, was owned by Reed. But I hoped Mina hadn't gotten that far in her search. "I thought so." Preston looked relieved. "I told her it was bullshit, but she was so sure." "She's bluffing." I sat down next to my son. "She's trying to scare you so she can get more in the property division." Don't fall for it. I'm trying, he smiled weakly. But she knows where to hit. She's not just threatening me, she's threatening you. Says she'll destroy us both if she doesn't get what she wants. And what does she want? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. A house or its equivalent in money, Preston sighed. $400,000. That's more than everything I own. I whistled. Mina had raised the stakes since she'd been talking to me. 250,000 turned into 400. Don't worry about it, I said, squeezing his shoulder. She won't get anything. Not the house, not the money. Honorin'? But if she does go to the police with her evidence, Preston looked worried. Even if it's all lies, the accusations alone could cause problems. For my career, for your reputation. He was right, and that worried me. Mina had sensed our vulnerability, and now she was pushing it with all her might. I had to act, and fast. Let me handle this, I said firmly. You don't have to worry about any charges or evidence. I'll handle it all. How? Preston looked at me with hope and doubt at the same time. I have my methods, I smiled, trying to look confident. Don't forget, I was a good detective. That seemed to calm him down a little. He nodded and leaned back on the back of the couch, looking exhausted but less stressed. Can I stay here tonight? He asked quietly. I don't want to go back to the apartment. There are too many memories. Sure. I was glad for the request. Your room is always ready for you. We sat for a while talking about different things, about his work, about old memories, about plans for the future. I could see that with each sip of brandy, the tension was gradually leaving his body. Finally, around midnight, he got up, said goodnight to me, and went upstairs to the room that had been his since childhood. I was left alone in the living room with an unfinished glass of whiskey and heavy thoughts. The situation was getting more dangerous by the hour. Mina knew about Reed, knew or guessed about the real owner of the house, and was ready to use that information for blackmail. This was no longer just a family matter. It was a threat to my entire life that I had built over the last 40 years. I had to talk to Reed, and as soon as possible, but not over the phone. Too risky. Tomorrow, when Preston left for work, I would go see Reed in person. We needed to work out a plan of action. With that decision made, I finished my whiskey and went upstairs. As I passed Preston's room, I heard muffled sobs. My son, my strong and smart boy, was crying like a baby, tucked into his pillow. I stood at the door listening to his grief and felt my heart break with pain and anger. Mina was going to pay for this, for the pain she'd caused Preston, for the threats against me, for dragging Reed into her dirty games. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I was determined to make sure she regretted the day she decided to play against me. With that thought, I went to my room, knowing that tomorrow was going to be an important and possibly dangerous day. But I was prepared for it. After all, I had spent my life balancing on the edge of the law. And if I had to cross that line again to protect my son, I would do so without hesitation. The morning began with rain, small but persistent, pounding on the roof and windows, turning the world behind the glass into a blurry watercolor. I was up early before 7, awakened by troubling dreams and aching joints. Old age doesn't bring peace as the poets promise. It brings insomnia and constant reminders that your body isn't what it used to be. Preston was still asleep when I came downstairs. I brewed coffee, strong black coffee, the way I'd loved it when I was young, and sat by the window, watching the rain and thinking about my upcoming conversation with Reed. What would I tell him? How will I explain that my sister-in-law is blackmailing both of us? And more importantly, how do I convince him to solve this problem the legal way? I knew Reed well enough to imagine his reaction. For a man in his position, the simplest solution is often the most radical. The problem simply disappears, literally or figuratively. And while deep down a part of me would have liked to see Mina disappear from our lives, I couldn't let that happen. Not because of her, because of Preston. He didn't deserve to live with such a weight on his conscience without even knowing it. Around 8 o'clock, Preston came downstairs dressed in his work suit, but with eyes red from sleep deprivation. He looked better than yesterday, but not by much. "Oh, sorry. Good morning, Father," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "You're up early." "Old habit," I replied. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I've slept lately," He smiled weakly. Thank you for letting me stay. This house is always open to you. I gestured to the toast I'd made. Breakfast? No thanks. Preston shook his head. No appetite, and I have to get to work. We have an important case today. He sipped his coffee, standing at the window, staring out at the rain. I could see how hard it was for him to focus on work when his personal life was falling apart. But I respected his decision to keep functioning, to not give in to despair. What are you going to do about Mina? I asked cautiously. My lawyer thinks we have a strong case, Preston replied without turning around. Marnie, if her accusations about you and this Emerson guy are just a bluff, then we have nothing to worry about. If, I repeated, feeling a prick of anxiety. Preston turned to me, his gaze sharp and attentive, so similar to my own when I was younger. Is there something you're not telling me, Father? He asked bluntly. I could have lied. It would have been the easiest thing to do. But Preston deserved at least part of the truth. Sub interim, Reed Emerson was a client of mine years ago, I said after a pause. I helped him with a case, and he was grateful. We maintained a professional relationship. A professional relationship with a known crime boss. Preston shook his head. Father, do you realize how that sounds? I was a private investigator, Preston. I spread my hands. In my line of work, you couldn't always pick your clients. And not everything they said about Emerson was true. It was a half-truth, and we both knew it. But Preston didn't press further. He finished his coffee and set the cup on the table. I gotta go, he said. I'll call you tonight. Take care of yourself. I walked him to the door. And don't let Mina break you. You're stronger than you think. He nodded, gave me a quick but tight hug, and walked out into the rain. I stood in the doorway watching him get in his car and drive away, and felt the weight of responsibility pressing on my shoulders. I had to protect him, not just from Mina, but from the truth about my past. Back at the house, I immediately grabbed the phone. I knew Reed's number by heart, though I rarely called him. The phone picked up after the second ring. This is Reed. The voice was not Reed's. Too young, too cold. Hines. This is Woodrow Kirby, I said. I need to speak to Reed. It's urgent. Just a minute, the voice answered, and the line fell into silence. Half a minute later, I heard Reed's familiar voice. Woodrow, his tone was wary. What's wrong? We need to meet. I didn't waste time with preamble. Today, it's serious. How serious? Reed asked. Blackmail, threats to expose our, business relationship, and the truth about the house. Silence. I could only hear his breathing on the other end of the line. Come back in an hour, he finally said, to the old place. I'll be there. I hung up the phone, feeling the adrenaline start to flow through my veins. The old place isn't Reed's office in the textile mill building. It's a private hunting lodge on the outskirts of town, the place where we used to meet when absolute privacy was needed. I hadn't been there in years, but I knew I could find my way there with my eyes closed. I packed quickly, put on my raincoat and hat. It was still raining, and walked out to my old Buick. The car didn't start right away, as if protesting against traveling in such weather, but finally gave in. The drive took almost 40 minutes more than I had anticipated because of the rain and morning traffic. The hunting lodge was in the woods 10 miles from town, on private property owned by one of Reed's companies. It looked like an ordinary wooden house, unremarkable except for the fact that inside it was state-of-the-art and completely wiretap-proof. When I pulled up, a black SUV with tinted windows was already parked out front. Reed was always punctual. I parked next to it and hurried to the porch, taking shelter from the rain, which had intensified by then. The door opened before I could knock. A young man stood on the doorstep, probably the same one whose voice I'd heard on the phone. He gave me an appraising look, nodded, and stepped aside to let me inside. Reed was waiting in the living room, sitting in a chair by the fireplace, the fire crackling. Despite the warm weather, the house was cool and damp. Old wooden structures, always like this when it rained. Woodrow, Reed stood up when I came in. You look drenched. Whiskey? I'll have one. I took off my raincoat and hung it on the hook by the door. Reed nodded to the young man, and he immediately went to the bar to prepare drinks. Reed and I sat by the fireplace, watching the fire in silence until we got our glasses. So, Reed took a sip of whiskey. Blackmail, you said. Who? My sister-in-law, Mina, I sighed. She's divorcing Preston and wants the house, or its value in money. Reed listened intently as I told him the whole story. Mina's visit, her threats, the fact that she'd apparently discovered the connection between me and Reed, and her suspicions about the real owner of the house. She's smart, Reed remarked when I was done. And dangerous. That combination could cause trouble. That's why I'm here, I leaned forward. We need to decide what to do. Reed set the glass down on the table between us and folded his hands in front of him, a gesture I knew to be a sign that he was deep in thought. There are different ways to solve this problem, he said slowly. Some of them are definitive. I had expected that. Reed had always been a practical man, and in his world, eliminating a threat often meant eliminating a person. No, I shook my head. I can't let this happen. Not because of her, because of Preston. It would destroy him. Your son will never know, Reed objected. People disappear every day, Woodrow, especially people who poke their noses in their own business. He'll know, I was adamant. Maybe not on a conscious level, but he'll know. And so will I. No, Reed, there has to be another way. A legitimate one. Reed looked at me for a long moment, then smiled slightly, not with his lips, with his eyes. Still clinging to your moral code, he said, even after everything we've been through. Especially after everything we've been through, I corrected. I don't want to add another sin to my list. Reed nodded, as if he'd been expecting that answer. Okay, he took the glass again. The legal way. What does she have against us? Suspicions, I shrugged. Maybe pictures of us together. Maybe some hints in my old notes. But nothing concrete, or she'd have gone to the police with it by now instead of trying to blackmail me. So she's bluffing. Reed tapped his fingers thoughtfully on his glass. But bluffing can be dangerous if you let it develop. We need to get ahead of her. How? I asked. The deeds to the house, Reed leaned forward. They're in the name of Arcadia Investments. It's a legitimate business, Woodrow. Yes, I own it through a series of intermediaries, but it's clean on paper. I nodded. When Reed offered me a place to live in the house 40 years ago, he made sure to make sure everything was legally immaculate. I was an official tenant for life, paid a token rent of $1 a year, and it was all enshrined in a contract drawn up by the best lawyers. Your sister-in-law is looking for skeletons in the closet, Reed continued. But instead, we can show her that the closet is completely transparent and empty. You're suggesting we reveal the truth? I was surprised. To admit that the house belongs to your company? Not mine, Reed shook his head. Arcadia Investments is a corporation with many shareholders. I'm just one of them, a small, insignificant one. And you're a valuable long-term tenant who helps maintain the company's image as a socially responsible business. I was beginning to understand his plan. We turn her exposure into nothing, I said slowly, showing that everything is legitimate and transparent. Awakening. Exactly, Reed smiled. And what's more, we can use it against her. If she tries to claim there's some sort of illicit relationship between us, we can sue her for defamation, with documents proving that our relationship is legitimate. And if she digs deeper? I still had my doubts. Start looking for the real owners of Arcadia? Let her look, Reed shrugged. The corporate structure was so complex, even the feds couldn't figure it out for years. And your sister-in-law, she's smart, but not that smart. The plan was good. Turn the secret into an open book, depriving Mina of her only bargaining chip. But there was one other thing that bothered me. What about Preston? I asked. How could I explain to him why I'd been living in a rented house all this time instead of my own? Tell him the truth. Partial, Reed took a sip of whiskey, that after your wife died, you couldn't afford to keep a big house, that Arcadia offered you a favorable lease, given your age and service to the community. It sounded noble and plausible. I nodded, mulling over his words. The plan could work. It should have worked, but something still bothered me. What if she'd already gone to the police? I asked. Nah, sorry. What if she'd already started an investigation? My people would know about it, Reed answered confidently. In the Grand Forks Police Department, I have friends. No, Woodrow. She's bluffing, hoping to get the money. And we have to show her that bluff doesn't work. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the tension release a little. The plan was risky, but doable. And most importantly, as legal as possible in our situation. When do we start? I asked. Immediately, Reed set down his glass and stood up. I'll have my lawyers prepare all the necessary documents. They'll contact you tomorrow. In the meantime, he walked over to the bar and pulled out a folder. Here's a copy of your lease with Arcadia. My lawyers have the original, but this should be enough to show Preston. I took the folder, feeling the heavy paper chill my fingers. Inside was a contract, drawn up 40 years ago but still valid. A contract that confirmed my legend and could protect my son. Thank you, Reed. I rose, extending my hand. He shook it, his grip as tight as it had been when I was young. Don't thank me, Woodrow, he said gravely. I'm still indebted to you. And if this plan doesn't work, his eyes darkened. Karim, there are other ways of dealing with things. I nodded, not wanting to pursue the subject. We both knew that if the legal way didn't work, we'd have to consider alternatives. But for now, I had hope it wouldn't come to that. Leaving the hunting lodge, I felt more confident. I had a plan, I had my cover, I had my paperwork. Now the hard part was telling Preston at least part of the truth. I got home for dinner. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still overcast, heralding another downpour. As I parked in front of the house, I noticed an unfamiliar car across the street, a dark blue sedan with a man behind the wheel. He sat motionless, staring straight ahead, but I could feel his attention. An observer. Mina wasted no time. She had already started her game. I went into the house, locked the door, and immediately called Preston. His cell phone was unavailable. He was probably in court. I left a message asking him to call me back as soon as possible and sat down to wait. Around 3 in the afternoon, the phone rang. I rushed to it, expecting to hear my son's voice, but it wasn't him. Mr. Kirby? The voice was male, professional. My name is Andrew Paxton. I'm Mina Kirby's attorney. I'm calling to discuss my client's claim regarding property to be included in the divorce proceedings. I sighed. So Mina was moving on to official action. Mr. Paxton, I said calmly, I'm afraid your client has misled you. I am not a party to the divorce proceedings, and my assets are not subject to division. Technically, you're right, Paxton agreed. Cimarron. However, according to information from my client, your house should be considered a potential inheritance of your son, Mr. Preston Kirby, and as such, it is relevant to the property division case. Your client is mistaken. I tried to speak calmly but firmly. I don't own this house. I lease it from Arcadia Investments on a life tenancy. When I die, the house reverts to the company, not to my son. A pause on the other end of the line. I could almost see Paxton hastily jotting down this unexpected information. Do you have any documents to prove it? He finally asked. Of course, I replied. A lease contract 40 years ago, renewed every 10 years. I can provide a copy if you'd like. That would be helpful. Paxton sounded less confident. But my client also claims that she has information about your ties to certain individuals in Grand Forks. Information that may be of interest to law enforcement. You mean my professional relationships with various clients when I was a private investigator? I chuckled. Mr. Paxton, I worked with a variety of people. Some were upstanding citizens, some were not. But I've always acted within the law. If your client is implying something else, I'd advise her to be careful with such accusations. Slander is a serious matter. Pause again. I could hear Paxton flipping through the papers. Mr. Kirby, he said at last, a note of caution in his voice. I'd like to meet with you personally to discuss these matters in more detail. Perhaps we can come to an agreement that will satisfy all parties. I'm open to a meeting, I agreed, but only in the presence of my son's attorney. This is his divorce, after all. Of course, Paxton sounded almost relieved. I'll contact Mr. Preston Kirby's lawyer and arrange the meeting. After the conversation was over, I felt a strange satisfaction. Reed's plan was beginning to work. Already the first contact with Mina's lawyer showed that they were not as sure of their position as they wanted to appear. In the evening, Preston called. He sounded tired but more collected than the day before. Father, he said, Lawrence, my lawyer, called me. He said Mina's representative wants to meet with both of us. What's going on? Nashri, I'll tell you when I meet you, I replied. There's something I should have told you a long time ago about the house. The house? Preston sounded confused. What about it? It's not mine, I said simply. It never had been. I rent it from a company called Arcadia Investments, with the right to live there for life. The silence on the other end was so long, I thought the connection had been cut. Preston? I finally called out. I'm here. His voice sounded strange. I'm just trying to process. Why didn't you ever talk about it? Pride, I guess, I sighed. After your mother died, I couldn't afford to keep a house this big. Arcadia offered me the deal, and I accepted. But I didn't want you to know that your father couldn't provide for his family. Another lie, but closer to the truth than any of the others. And convincing enough, I hoped. Father, Preston's voice softened. You should never have been ashamed of it in front of me. I would have understood. I know, I felt a prick of guilt. But sometimes it's hard for us old people to admit our weaknesses, especially in front of the kids. I'll come back tomorrow, Preston said. We'll talk more about it, and the meeting with the lawyers. After talking to my son, I felt exhausted, like I'd run a marathon. Lying is exhausting, even if it's for the greater good, especially if it's for the greater good. I sat at the window watching the rain begin to fall again. The blue sedan was still parked across the street, but now there were two people in it. The watchers had switched. Mina was persistent. The phone rang again. This time it was one of Reed's lawyers, introducing himself as Daniel Morton. He spoke dryly and matter-of-factly, informing me that the documents were ready, that they were completely true to historical truth, with the correct dates and signatures, and that they would be delivered to me tomorrow. Mr. Emerson also asked me to tell you that the situation is under control, Morton added at the end of the conversation, and that you need not worry about the observers. They'll be taken care of. I didn't ask what that meant. With Reed, sometimes it was better not to know the details. Night came quickly, bringing with it an increase in rain and sharp gusts of wind. I sat in my chair by the fireplace, listening to the rain drumming on the roof, and pondered the days ahead. The plan was good, but its success depended on many factors. On Mina and her lawyer's reaction, on how deep she'd already dug, what exactly she knew or thought she knew, and most importantly, whether Preston would believe my story. Because at the end of the day, I did it all for him, to protect him not only from Mina, but from the truth about my past, about my relationship with Reed Emerson, about the decisions I'd made 40 years ago that had shaped the rest of my life. I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of the rain, and thought about how some secrets were better left unsolved, even if the price for that is a life of lies. The morning of the trial was surprisingly clear after a week of steady rain. I stood at my bedroom window, watching the sunlight play on the wet leaves of the trees, and thought about the day ahead. The nervous tension I felt was strange. I hadn't felt anything like it in years. 2 weeks had passed since my conversation with Reed. 2 weeks of preparation, of gathering documents, of endless meetings with lawyers. Preston was shocked to learn the truth about the house, but as I expected, he quickly accepted it. My son has always been noted for his practicality, another trait he inherited from me. I carefully dressed in my best suit, dark gray with a vest, old-fashioned but elegant. It made me look exactly as I wanted to appear in court, an elderly but dignified man, a retired professional who lives modestly but with dignity. Preston picked me up at 9 o'clock. He too was in a suit, but more modern, appropriate for a young lawyer. His face was determined. He was clearly preparing for the day, setting himself up for confrontation. The courthouse, a stately red brick structure dating back to the late 19th century, towered over the modern office buildings surrounding it as a reminder of more respectable times. We met Preston's attorney, Lawrence Price, in the courthouse lobby. Price was younger than I expected, no more than 35, but with a confident look and a firm handshake. In the hallway, we saw Mina and her attorney, Andrew Paxton, who looked exactly as I'd envisioned him, a tall, lean man with sharp facial features and cold eyes. Typical shark of a lawyer. Mina, dressed in a strict navy blue suit, looked confident and even triumphant. She noticed us and smiled. Not a warm smile, but a predatory smile that didn't touch her eyes. We were allowed into the courtroom at 10 o'clock sharp. I looked around the room carefully but didn't see Reed or any of his men. That alarmed me a little, but I reminded myself that Reed always keeps his word. Judge Elizabeth Montgomery, a middle-aged woman with a shrewd eye and a stern expression, entered the room and everyone stood up. Paxton was the first to speak, presenting Mina's claims. He spoke smoothly and persuasively, describing how his client had devoted 7 years of marriage to Preston Kirby, supporting his career and sacrificing her own professional opportunities. Your Honor, Paxton continued, my client is entitled to just compensation for the years spent on this marriage. We demand an equal division of the jointly acquired property, including Mr. Preston Kirby's potential inheritance from his father, Mr. Woodrow Kirby, namely the house located at 17 Oak Street. Judge Montgomery listened intently, taking notes, then turned to Price. Mr. Price, what is your position? Price stood up, looking collected and professional. Your Honor, my client's position is simple. First, the marriage was dissolved by Mr. Kirby because of his wife's infidelity, which is supported by documentary evidence. Second, the potential inheritance cannot be included in the division of property because it is not jointly acquired. And third, the house claimed by Mrs. Kirby does not actually belong to my client's father and will never belong to my client. This statement caused whispers in the hall. Mina straightened in her seat, clearly surprised by such a direct attack. Explain yourself, Mr. Price, said the judge. With your permission, Your Honor. Price took out a folder with documents. I have a lease signed by Mr. Woodrow Kirby and Arcadia Investments 40 years ago. According to that contract, Mr. Kirby has the right to live in the house for life, but the house itself belongs to the company, and upon Mr. Kirby's death, it reverts to the owner, not inherited. The judge accepted the documents and began to study them. Mina leaned toward her attorney, whispering something fiercely. Your Honor, Paxton said, rising, we're challenging the authenticity of this contract. It may have been drafted retroactively to avoid an equitable division of property. Furthermore, we have reason to believe that Mr. Woodrow Kirby has ties to certain Grand Forks criminal elements, and this may be part of a scheme to hide assets. Judge Montgomery frowned. Yes, that's a serious accusation, Mr. Paxton. Do you have any proof? At that moment, the courtroom doors opened, and all heads turned in that direction. 3 men entered the hall. First to walk in was Reed Emerson, tall, gray-haired, impeccably dressed, radiating an aura of authority that was impossible to ignore. I apologize for my tardiness, Your Honor, he said with a slight smile. My name is Reed Emerson, and I am the chairman of the board of directors of Arcadia Investments. I have been informed that my company's ownership is being discussed in this room, and I felt it was my duty to personally clarify the situation. Mr. Emerson, this is an unusual situation. You are not a party to this divorce case. Of course I am, Your Honor, but since my company's assets are at issue here, and serious allegations are being made against me, I believe I have a right to speak, if you'll allow me. Mina looked as if she'd seen a ghost. Her face went pale, her eyes widened with shock. Paxton was stunned too, frantically thumbing the papers in front of him. Judge Montgomery thought for a moment, then nodded. Given the unusual circumstances and the seriousness of the charges, I'll allow you to take the stand, Mr. Emerson. Reed nodded and stepped closer. One of the lawyers handed him a folder of documents. Your Honor, Reed began, Arcadia Investments is a legitimate company founded by my father in 1955. We're in the real estate investment business, and the house at 17 Oak Street has been one of our assets for over 50 years. He pulled out some documents and handed them to the judge. Here's the certificate of title, duly registered with the Grand Forks Land Registry. And here is the lease signed with Mr. Woodrow Kirby 40 years ago, with subsequent renewals every 10 years. And finally, a statement from the Internal Revenue Service confirming that Arcadia Investments had been faithfully paying the tax on the property for all those years. The judge scrutinized the documents while the room was dead silent. Everything looks in order, Judge Montgomery finally said. Mr. Emerson, could you explain to the court the nature of your arrangement with Mr. Kirby? Reed nodded, turning so that he could see everyone present. It would be my pleasure, Your Honor. 40 years ago, Mr. Woodrow Kirby provided an invaluable service to my father. He was a private investigator who helped clear my father's name of false accusations. In gratitude, my father offered him a lifetime lease on one of the company houses for a nominal fee of $1 a year. The judge nodded, clearly impressed. And what would happen to the house after Mr. Kirby's death? She asked. According to the contract, the house will revert to the company, Reed replied. It is not part of Mr. Kirby's inheritance and cannot be passed on to his heirs. Mina stood up abruptly, her face contorted with anger. This is a conspiracy, she exclaimed. They're all in on it. Woodrow, Preston, that... She pointed to Reed, hesitating to say his name aloud. They're conspiring to rob me of my fair share. Mrs. Kirby, the judge's voice became harsh. Otto, pull yourself together or I'll be forced to hold you in contempt. Mina was silent, but her eyes threw lightning bolts. She slumped back in her seat, clenching her fists so hard her knuckles turned white. Judge Montgomery turned to Reed. Thank you for your explanations, Mr. Emerson. They've been very helpful to the court. You are dismissed. Reed nodded with a slight smile and left the room with his lawyers. The next hour was spent discussing other aspects of the divorce proceedings, division of jointly acquired property, alimony issues, and so on. But the main battle had already been won. Mina's demands for the house had been officially rejected, and her blackmail attempt had publicly failed. When the hearing was over and the judge retired to her room, Preston and I went out into the hallway. Mina and Paxton lingered in the hall, arguing furiously about something. I was relieved that the plan had worked even better than we'd expected, thanks to Reed's personal appearance. Outside, Reed was waiting for us, standing outside his black SUV. Next to him were two bodyguards scrutinizing the surroundings. Mr. Kirby, Reed smiled, turning to Preston and extending his hand. We've finally met in person. Your father has told me a lot about you. Preston shook his hand, looking a little embarrassed. I always protect my friends, Reed said, glancing at me, and your father is one of the oldest. I didn't realize you two were so close. Preston looked thoughtful. There are a lot of things in life that we don't tell even our closest people. Reed patted him on the shoulder. But rest assured, your father is a man to be proud of. And if you ever need help, you can always come to me. For him. Reed turned to me and shook my hand. It went well, he said quietly. But be careful. Your sister-in-law isn't the type to give up easily. I nodded, understanding the warning. Thank you, Reed, I said sincerely. For everything. He smiled, nodded goodbye to Preston, and got into the car. The SUV started gently and disappeared around the corner. Preston and I remained standing on the courthouse steps, savoring the moment of silence after the storm. Let's go home, Father, Preston finally said. I think we deserve a good dinner and a glass of whiskey. I agreed, and we headed for his car. As I sat inside, I noticed Mina coming out of the courthouse. She was standing on the top step, looking around as if lost. Her face was a mixture of anger, frustration, and surprisingly, fear. Our eyes met through the windshield, and I saw pure hatred in her gaze. In that moment, I realized that Reed was right. Mina wasn't the type to give up easily. Even though we had won today, the war wasn't over. The week after the trial was strangely quiet. I expected some kind of retaliation from Mina. A call, a threat, a surprise visit. But nothing happened. She seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving behind only a sense of uncertainty. Preston called every day with updates on the divorce proceedings. According to him, Mina had suddenly become surprisingly cooperative. She agreed to the standard division of property, refused any additional demands, and seemed in a hurry to finalize things as soon as possible. It's strange, Father, Preston said during one of our phone conversations. Paxton seems as surprised as we are. He says he's never seen a client change position so abruptly. I had my suspicions about the reasons for her sudden transformation, but I didn't want to share them with my son. Reed Emerson wasn't the kind of man you could threaten with impunity. I didn't know exactly what he did or said to Mina after the trial, but the result was obvious. She was afraid. On the 10th day after the trial, Preston arrived at my house unannounced. I saw his car through the window and felt my heart clench with anxiety. Such spontaneous visits rarely brought good news. When I opened the door, I saw my son with a bottle of good whiskey in one hand and a folder of papers in the other. His face was tense but determined. The divorce is officially finalized, Preston set the bottle on the hall table. The papers were signed and certified this morning. I'm free to go. Is that? Good? I asked cautiously, trying to read his mood. I don't know, he shrugged. On the one hand, I'm glad this nightmare is over. On the other, 7 years of life, Father. 7 years like a wave washed away. We sat by the fireplace, me in my usual chair, him on the sofa opposite. I poured the whiskey into glasses and we drank in silence. And Mina, I finally asked, what are her plans? She's leaving. Preston took another sip. Today, California, I think. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. I noticed the folder Preston had placed on the table. What's in it? I asked, nodding at it. The results of my little investigation, he said, opening the folder. About you, about Reed Emerson, about Arcadia Investments. I felt a chill run down my spine. What did you find? I asked, trying to sound calm. A lot. Preston pulled out several sheets of paper. 40 years ago, Reed Emerson was accused of murdering his competitor, one Joseph Mulligan. The evidence was compelling. Fingerprint weapons, witnesses. But suddenly there was an alibi, corroborated by an independent private investigator. You. I was silent as I watched my son unravel the threads of the past. You proved that Reed couldn't have killed Mulligan because he was somewhere else at the time of the murder. Preston continued. The charges were dropped, and a few months later, you suddenly moved into this house that turned out to belong to a company connected to Reed. He looked up at me with a look full of questions. That's not a coincidence, is it, Father? I sighed. The moment of truth had come sooner than I'd expected. Sahab, no, I finally answered, as it's not a coincidence. I stood up and walked over to the bar, pouring myself another whiskey. I did investigate Reed Emerson, I began, walking back to my chair. And I did find evidence that he was innocent of Mulligan's murder. He didn't kill him, Preston. It was a setup organized by his competitors. But Preston sensed I wasn't telling the truth. But in the course of my investigation, I uncovered other evidence. Documents that could put Reed away for years on other charges. Racketeering, bribery, money laundering. I took a sip of whiskey, feeling the liquid burn my throat. And you destroyed that evidence, Preston said quietly. It wasn't a question, an assertion. I nodded, unable to lie. Why? Preston asked, and there was so much in that simple question, perplexity, frustration, trying to understand. I don't know, I answered honestly. Sometimes I think it was out of a sense of justice. Reed didn't kill Mulligan, and it didn't seem right to me that he'd be sent to prison for other crimes when the real killer would have gone free. Sometimes I think I just liked Reed, his straightforwardness, his code of honor, albeit a peculiar one. I looked at my son, expecting to see judgment, but instead I saw only an attentive gaze, an attempt to understand. And the house was. Reward, he asked. Not exactly, I shook my head. More like a thank you. And maybe Reed's way of making sure I didn't change my mind and take that evidence to the police later. The house had tied us up. Preston nodded, considering my words. And Mom? Did she know? Yes, I smiled, remembering Eliza. Your mother knew everything. She was wiser than I was, saw further. At first she was against it, afraid for us, for you. But then she realized that Reed was honest in his own way. He always kept his word. And he always protected those he thought were his own. Like he protected us from Mina, Preston said thoughtfully. Yeah, I nodded. Sure, Reed never forgot a debt or a favor. Preston stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the street. You know what's the strangest thing, Father? He said without turning around. I'm not shocked. I'm not outraged. You should be. You spent your whole life teaching me to respect the law, to be honest. And you violated your own principles, I finished for him. I know, and that's what I've been living with every day for the last 40 years. Do you regret it? Hajar, Preston asked, turning to me. I hesitated for a moment. It was a question I'd asked myself 1,000 times. Sometimes, I said finally, when I think about the things I could have done differently, about the people Reed might have hurt after I'd saved him, about what an example I was to you. But then I remember how happy your mother and I were in this house, how you grew up here, playing in this garden, and I think that maybe it wasn't all so wrong. Preston walked back to the couch and sat down, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Did you ever want to tell me the truth? He asked. Every day, I answered without hesitation. But I was afraid you'd be disappointed, that you'd look at me the way you're looking at me now. Like what? Preston raised his eyebrows. Like a stranger. I looked away. Or like someone you thought you knew, but it turns out you don't. Preston was silent for a moment, then sighed. I don't know how I feel, Father, he said honestly. Part of me is really disappointed. But another part understands, or wants to understand. We all make choices we can't always explain even to ourselves. He stood up and walked over to my chair, kneeling beside me, the way he used to do when he was a kid, when he wanted to talk seriously about something. I need time to process all of this, but I want you to know that you're still my father, and I still love you, no matter what you did 40 years ago. I felt a lump come up in my throat. This grown man, my son, had a wisdom and strength that had always been inherent in him, but that I hadn't always recognized, seeing him primarily as a child in need of protection. Thank you, I said quietly, putting my hand on his shoulder. We stayed in that position for a while, listening to the ticking of the old clock and the crackling of the fire in the fireplace. Then Preston got up and walked back to the couch. What now? He asked. Saw her with Mina? With Reed? With the house? Mina disappeared from our lives, I shrugged. I think Reed talked to her after the trial. I don't know what he said or did, but the result is obvious. She's scared and in a hurry to get as far away as possible. And the house? Preston continued. Will you continue to live here? Yes, I smiled, looking around at the familiar walls. This is my home, Preston. No matter who legally owns it. This is where most of my life has been. This is where I was happy with your mother. This is where I raised you. And this is where I plan to grow old. It was well past midnight when Preston got ready to leave. We stood at the door, and I could see that something else was troubling him. Was something wrong? I asked. I was just thinking. He hesitated. About what Reed said in court, that when you die, the house goes back to the company, which means, that you won't inherit it, I finished it for him. Yeah, that's true. I'm sorry, Preston. It's part of our arrangement with Reed. To my surprise, Preston laughed. Father, do you think I care? He shook his head. I never considered this house as my inheritance. It's yours, your refuge, your fortress. And if that is the price for your peace and safety, I am willing to pay it. I hugged my son, feeling pride and love overwhelm me. After Preston left, I went back to the living room and sat in my chair, looking at the burning fire in the fireplace. I thought about the path that had brought me here, the decisions I'd made, the price I'd paid, and the gains I'd gotten in return. 40 years ago, I had made a choice that tied my fate to that of Reed Emerson. I lived in his home, enjoyed his protection, became part of his world. It was a compromise with my own principles, with my understanding of justice. Life is a series of choices, and we never fully know their consequences when we make them. We make choices based on what we know and feel in the moment, and we live with the consequences. Sometimes those consequences are painful, sometimes they bring unexpected joys, but they always shape us, make us who we are. I was Woodrow Kirby, former private investigator, widower, father, friend of a crime boss, keeper of secrets. And despite all the compromises and doubts, I could look in the mirror and recognize the man who looked back at me. Not perfect, not flawless, but real. And now, thanks to an unexpected twist of fate, I had a chance to be honest as well, at least with my own son. It was a gift I hadn't expected and probably didn't deserve, but I was grateful for it.